Hello everyone, wishing you and your family a peaceful day. Just as the farm is being prepared for a warm and quiet Tet, Toan has to leave in the night to face a past he once tried to bury. Leaving Tu Diem alone in a yard filled with lights and waiting, will the fragile peace they have built be strong enough to survive what is coming? Now let's explore the story of Toan and Tu Diem together. If you enjoy this journey, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. The morning after Tuan left arrived quietly, not with any dramatic change, but with the same pale light spreading across the yard, touching the rows of flower pots and the wooden porch in a way that made everything look unchanged. And it was precisely that sameness that made his absence impossible to ignore. Tu Diem woke earlier than usual, though she had barely slept, and for a few seconds after opening her eyes, she remained still, listening for the familiar sounds that had filled every morning since they came to the farm. The movement of a chair, the metallic clink of a bucket being lifted, the low voice calling her name from the yard. But the only thing she heard was the faint rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bird somewhere beyond the fields. She stepped outside with the quiet care of someone who did not want to disturb a space that was already too empty. And the first thing she saw was the string lights still wrapped around the tree from the night before, their thin wire catching the early light, the red lanterns hanging above them, motionless in the still air. Everything bore the trace of their shared work. The way the flower pots had been aligned, the new soil still dark from yesterday's watering, the broom placed where he had leaned it after sweeping. And the yard looked less like a place and more like a memory that had not yet settled. Instead of sitting down, she went directly to the basin and began washing clothes. Not because there were many to wash, but because the steady movement of soaking, rubbing, and rinsing gave her hands something to do and kept her from looking too often toward the gate. The sound of water splashing against the metal surface broke the silence in a way that was almost comforting. And her movements, though unhurried, carried the quiet determination of someone trying to hold the day together through ordinary tasks. From time to time, she pushed a strand of damp hair back from her forehead with the back of her wrist, leaving a faint trace of water across her skin. And each time she straightened her back, she found her eyes returning to the road beyond the fence without realizing she had turned her head. When the first sunlight reached the porch, she moved the small wooden table slightly to the side to follow the shade, then went inside to bring out the cakes they had made the day before, arranging them carefully on a plate, even though there was no immediate reason to do so. The knife lay where Toan had left it, and for a moment she rested her hand on the handle before cutting one piece into two smaller portions, placing one on the chair opposite her out of habit and only later realizing the gesture. Mr. Z. Nam's arrival came without noise, the sound of his footsteps on the dirt path softer than the breeze. He stood outside the gate and called her name once in the same calm tone he always used. And when she opened it, he did not step in immediately, but looked at the yard in a way that suggested he was measuring its quietness. He told her that Toan had reached the station and that everything was proceeding as planned, that there was no need for her to worry, and although the words were simple, they settled in her chest like something solid she could hold on to. After he left, the morning continued in its slow, deliberate rhythm. She watered the flowers, lifting the bucket with both hands the way she had insisted on doing when Toan tried to carry it alone. And when the water spilled over the edge and ran across her fingers, she almost smiled at the memory of their laughter from the day before. She adjusted the lantern string where the knot had loosened slightly, standing on the small stool and placing her hand against the tree for balance in the exact position where his shoulder had been under her palm. And for a brief moment, the closeness of that remembered contact made her pause. The phone lay on the table inside, and she did not bring it with her to the yard, telling herself that if it rang she would hear it. Yet every few minutes she walked back to the porch to check the dark screen. The fields beyond the house were already alive with the distant sound of tractors, reminding her that the season was moving forward regardless of anyone's private waiting, and the ordinary persistence of that sound gave the morning a structure she could lean against. She prepared a simple meal but did not eat much, leaving half of it covered on the table as if he might return before noon, then sat down for a while with her hands folded in her lap, her gaze moving between the gate and the string lights above. The farm, which had once felt like a temporary refuge, now seemed to hold every trace of their effort to make it a home, and she realized that each small task they had shared, tying a knot, carrying water, cutting a cake, had become a way of binding the place to their lives. By the time the sunlight stood high above the trees, the shadows had withdrawn completely from the yard, and the air had grown warm. Yet she continued to move through the same quiet cycle of checking the flowers, wiping the table, rearranging objects that did not need rearranging. The phone finally rang when she was inside, and she reached it so quickly that the chair behind her shifted with a sharp sound. Toan's voice came through steady and calm, telling her that things were going well, that she should eat and rest, that he would return later in the day, and she answered in the same measured tone, not wanting him to hear how tightly she was holding the receiver. After the call ended, the morning no longer felt suspended. The waiting had taken on a direction, and although the yard remained unchanged, the light falling across it seemed warmer, the breeze moving through the leaves softer. She carried the plate of cakes back outside and sat down in the chair that faced the gate, not to watch the road constantly, but because it was the place where the two of them had always sat together, and in that simple act, the space regained its balance. The afternoon on the farm moved forward, not by the clock but by the quiet weight of waiting that settled over the yard. After the brief call from Toan, Tu Diem remained at the gate longer than she realized, her hand resting on the wooden latch, as though releasing it too soon would make the distance between them suddenly real. The dirt road in front of the house lay empty beneath the fading sunlight, and each time a breeze passed, lifting a thin line of dust and letting it fall again, it seemed to confirm that no one had come and no one had gone. When she finally turned back toward the porch and sat down, the chair across from her still faced the gate, left that way from the morning, as if it were waiting for its owner to return. The piece of cake on the table had cooled completely. Its cut edges had dried slightly, the green bean filling showing where the knife had passed, and she drew the plate closer by habit before stopping midway, her fingers resting on the wood because the movement no longer carried its old meaning when she was alone. Her phone lay beside it, dark and silent, yet she glanced at it again and again, not expecting a message, but unable to stop looking. The yard was so still that small sounds became clear. The shift of a leaf on the ground, the faint creak of the string lights where they wrapped around the tree, the distant rustle of the banana leaves behind the house. Everything remained exactly as it had been in the morning. The watering can by the steps, the broom leaning against the wall, the rows of flower pots they had repotted together. Their unchanged order made his absence more visible than any disturbance would have. When the sound of a motorbike slowed near the fence, she rose immediately, her body reacting before her thoughts. The rider did not stop, but the brief turn of his head toward the yard left a lingering unease in the air, even after the engine faded. Not long afterward, Mr. Nam returned, entering through the gate and closing it carefully behind him. He brought tea and a small bag of dry biscuits and sat in the chair that had been empty all day, pouring a cup and sliding it toward her without asking anything unnecessary. The steam between them softened the silence, and although their conversation was minimal, a quiet question about whether she had eaten, a small nod in reply, his presence steadied the space. The sunlight withdrew slowly from the yard, the shadow of the tree stretching toward the porch and climbing the wall, while the lanterns above touched lightly in the wind. Late in the afternoon, a man appeared at the gate and stood watching without entering, his eyes moving across every corner of the yard before resting briefly on Tu Diem. When Mr. Nam asked what he wanted, the man simply said it was nothing and walked away along the path behind the garden instead of toward the road. And that direction alone was enough to change the atmosphere. Mr. Nam checked the latch again, this time with more force, and when he sat down, his attention remained fixed on the back of the property. As evening approached, they turned on the string lights together. The small bulbs came alive one by one, spreading a warm glow across the yard that made everything look almost the same as the night before. Except that today there had been hours of waiting behind it. The insects began their steady chorus in the grass, and every distant engine sound made her lift her head. Then, from far down the road, came a rhythm she recognized. She did not stand immediately. She listened until she was certain. The headlight appeared at the curve, disappeared briefly behind the trees, and then returned, closer and clearer, until the motorbike stopped at the gate. Mr. Nam did not open it. Tuan called her name softly, and when she lifted the latch, her hand trembled. He stood there with dust on his sleeves and fatigue in the lines of his face, yet his eyes were calm in the familiar way that had carried her through the day. All the hours of waiting seemed to gather into the single moment when he said that he was home. Mr. Nam stepped forward, gave him a light pat on the shoulder, and left them without questions, as though he understood that this was not a time for words. Tuan wheeled the motorbike inside, closed the gate carefully, and stood in the middle of the yard for a moment, his gaze moving from the lights to the lanterns to the flower pots, checking everything in silence. When they sat down on the porch, there was a long pause before he spoke, saying that he would have to return to the station the next day and that the witness had recognized the two men. That things were becoming clearer. When she mentioned the stranger who had come in the afternoon, he said he already knew and told her not to open the gate for anyone unfamiliar, even if they claimed to know him. He broke off a piece of cake and handed it to her the same way he had in the morning, and they ate slowly without speaking. Afterward, he rose to check the gate again, then the back door, then the line of lights, adjusting a section where the wire had loosened. When he returned, he did not sit across from her but moved his chair closer until their shoulders touched. The yard was unchanged, the table, the lights, the flowers, yet the distance that had filled the entire day was gone. The farm, which had seemed to hold its breath from noon until dusk, finally exhaled in the quiet of their shared presence.
Sau một đêm Toan rời đi để làm việc với cơ quan chức năng, buổi sáng trên trang trại mở ra trong sự vắng lặng quen thuộc nhưng thiếu đi nhịp sống của hai người. Từ Diem cố giữ bình thường bằng những công việc nhỏ như giặt đồ, tưới hoa, dọn lại chiếc bàn gỗ, nhưng mọi thứ đều gợi nhớ đến sự có mặt của anh. Cuộc gọi ngắn của Toan mang lại chút yên tâm, song nỗi nhớ chờ đợi vẫn kéo dài suốt buổi chiều. Đặc biệt khi một người lạ xuất hiện trước cổng khiến không khí trở nên căng thẳng. Ông Nam đến ngồi cùng như một điểm tựa thầm lặng. Sau khi Toan trở về lúc trời tối, sự mệt mỏi và quyết tâm trong ánh mắt của anh cho thấy mọi chuyện chưa kết thúc. Họ ngồi cạnh nhau dưới dây đèn, ăn lại miếng bánh cũ, vừa bình yên vừa mong manh, chuẩn bị cho ngày phải tiếp tục đối diện với quá khứ.